This is a special edition of The World This Week following the Paris attacks. But first, let's take a quick look at other events around the world this week.
С варварскими террористическими преступлениями.
We support a Syrian-led transition process within a target of 6 months.
I think that was one of the worst foreign policy blunders in the modern history of the United States.
And now to what's happening in Europe. Belgium has become the #1 exporter of ISIS members per capita in Europe, and also now a major importer of terrorism to Europe. With us now from Brussels is Viviane Teitelbaum, member of the Belgian Parliament of the Reformist Movement. Thank you very much, Viviane, for joining us.
With pleasure.
Tell me, please, what was your reaction when you've heard about the Paris attacks, and did you suspect immediately that there's some Belgian connection there?
Well, the first reaction was one of shock, of sadness, and we were really it was like it came like a total surprise because I don't think people like us, our politicians like me, were expecting such a huge, massive and brutal attack on people's lives. So in that sense, yes, it was a total surprise. Now, regarding expectations with connections to Belgium, I have to admit that at the first moment, I turned to the person that was sitting next to me and I said, you'll see there might be a connection with Molenbeek. But I said that in such a way I didn't expect to be right. Unfortunately, it was the case.
And what about the Belgian authorities? I mean, did they miss the picture by not acting fast enough in Molenbeek?
Well, Belgian authorities have been working a lot. You know, they have been arresting over 160 people in the last month since the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the Cacher supermarket. We have prevented an attack in the city of Verviers. We have been working. Obviously, it's not enough, and I'm not sure that a democracy, and certainly Israel knows that, is always capable of preventing the worst. And sometimes there are failures in the system because those type of persons with their intentions use every way they can to bypass what the government puts into place. Now, Molenbeek, I have to admit, has been involved since the year 2001 with connections to terrorist attacks, because the person that killed Commander Massoud was the husband of someone living in Molenbeek, Malika El Arout, and she's now one of the jihadists on the internet recruiting a lot of people for jihad attacks. So after that, the person that was involved in the attack on the Jewish Museum had a link with Molenbeek. He spent the night there before. The person who attacked the Thalys train also had a connection with Molenbeek. Even the attacks of Paris with the Kouachi brothers and the Koulibaly, they bought their weapons that came from Molenbeek, and so on and so on. So it seems that there is a big problem that the government has really decided now to tackle more seriously.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of democracy, with all due respect to democracy, of course, should Belgium change in order to adapt to a new war on terrorism?
Well, I think everybody has to change now to answer the challenges that are raised with those terrorist attacks, and everybody agrees to say that it's a new war with a new enemy and an enemy from inside. So yes, definitely we have been, Belgium has been raising budgets regarding these fights. We have also lately sent away from the Belgian territory a preacher of a mosque, an imam that was preaching hatred. I think we are one of the first countries to do that. So we take that very seriously as well. I think that we have the army in front of all the Jewish buildings. As you know, since the attack on the Jewish Museum and Charlie Hebdo, increasingly we had first police and then army. So now we also have the threat alerts being raised for big events, and we cancelled our football game tonight. So obviously, yes, Belgium is changing and is taking measures to answer those new challenges, because the rationale behind those terrorist attacks and the minds of the jihadists, as you very well know, is something that is very difficult to apprehend in a manner that we would know and how to prevent the next phase. So we have decided to take a whole series of global measures.
Viviane Teitelbaum in Brussels, I thank you very much.
Thank you.
With me in the studio are Dr. Mark Heller, an expert on Middle East policies at the INSS, and Paula Slier, Middle East Bureau Chief for Russia Today. Paula, you've just come back from Syria following the Russian involvement in Syria. Well, tell us, how was it? What did you see?
Well, I was there just prior to the French attacks. We were primarily at the Russian base just outside the city of Latakia, the Russian Air Force base. And at one stage we were there non-stop for 24 hours, and without fail, every hour there were Russian planes taking to the skies. I saw Su-24, 30 and 34s. I interviewed the commander of the Air Force Base, and one thing he said really stays with me. He said, to quote him, that he was amazed by the amount of weaponry that they have found Islamic State and other terrorist groups to have. At the same time, he spoke about cooperation, not only with the Syrian forces on the ground and the Information Intelligence Center coming out of Baghdad, but also cooperation with opposition forces inside Syria. And his assessment was that it could still take another few months, although he was careful to put a time frame on it, but that it was that intelligence sharing that was the only way to go forward.
The Americans are talking about years. Dr. Heller, let me put it this way. A bunch of thugs with AK-47s on Toyotas. What is the problem?
Well, I think it's a bit of an oversimplification to describe them as simply as a bunch of thugs with Toyotas and AK-47s. Their resources are a lot more impressive than that. But I think the major problem is at a broader political strategic level, which is to say that most of the parties involved in the war in Syria have not designated ISIS as their primary enemy and the main focus of their effort. And therefore, all of the resources that are being committed by various parties to the war in Syria are not being directed against ISIS.
Well, now you have the French and Europeans, and you have the Russians. You have Putin acknowledging that it was an ISIS bomb on this Russian airplane. So is it going to be finally a focused effort against ISIS, especially by the Russians?
Well, we're seeing tentative signs in that direction. On the one hand, you have had the Russian president speaking on the phone with his French counterpart, Francois Hollande, and the Russian president has told his navy to coordinate efforts with the with the French naval forces that are on their way to the Mediterranean. This doesn't mean that there's going to be a military alliance, but it perhaps might be pointing in that direction. The Russians have been calling for cooperation with the Americans for a long time. The sticking point, of course, is the future of Assad.
The Americans are so reluctant. I mean, President Obama is not going to do anything that resembles putting boots on the ground, according to what we hear from the administration.
No, there's no indication whatsoever that the Americans are prepared to commit themselves to a large-scale ground invasion. They are escalating their involvement, as are some of the other Western allies in Syria. But from that to a full-scale land invasion is a very, very long way to go. And I would add, I think, that it's a bit misleading to think about the contacts between various parties involved in Syria as cooperation in the sense of all of them committing their resources to the same objective. They're not pursuing the same objective. Their notion of cooperation rarely extends beyond what is commonly called in the jargon deconflicting, which is to say making sure they don't end up shooting at each other.
If they agree, especially the Americans and the Russians, on removing Assad at one point, will that clear the way to a joint effort, a serious one?
I think it would remove a very serious obstacle, but of course it's not the whole story. Beyond removing Assad, they need to get some kind of consensus among them, and not just them, by the way, because Syria, because Turkey and Iran are also influential players there, some kind of consensus on what follows the removal of Assad, and I think we're a long way from that as well.
So you're not optimistic at all? So is ISIS invincible?
ISIS is ISIS as a movement or an organization is not invincible, provided that various parties are willing and able to devote the resources needed to deal with it. But beyond or behind ISIS, of course, there is an idea, the idea of jihadism.
This is not going away.
And that's not going away.
Not going away. Paul, at least according to reports in the Western world, Putin has agreed to sort of phase out Assad in Syria. Do you buy that?
It's not that he necessarily wants to phase out Assad, but what the Russians have been saying for quite some time is that they're not tied to Assad per se. They just want to see a continuation in Syria that doesn't lead to some kind of implosion. And their commitment to Assad, by and large, is really because they believe if Assad suddenly goes, you could have a repeat scenario in terms of what you had with Libya, with Muammar Gaddafi and the country in a complete state of disarray today. So the Russian point of view is that there needs to be a process, and also it needs to come from the bottom up. And there needs to be legitimacy given to this process that Syrians themselves support.
Paula and Dr. Hello, thank you very much. Let's go back to Belgium, the country that is so closely linked to the Paris attacks. Joining us from Brussels is journalist Aurore Bukassa. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Good evening, Jacob.
What was their reaction in Belgium when it turns out that there's such a big connection between Paris and Brussels?
Some people were not surprised at all because since January, after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, there were already connections made with Brussels, and also earlier, 1 year earlier, with the attacks against the Jewish Museum, it was shown that Mehdi Nemmouche was in Molenbeek. So the link between Paris and Brussels was not very surprising, sadly.
Yeah. Well, everybody now knows the scope of Islamic presence in Molenbeek and the number of Belgian citizens joining ISIS. But did the Belgian authorities ignore the signs?
They didn't ignore, but it's very difficult because Molenbeek is not, it's a very diverse area of Brussels. There are not only Muslim people, there are people who are just living a normal life. It's just very hard to say that all Molenbeek is to be blamed, and all the authority also, because, you know, it's at different levels. You have the educator on the street who are working with young people and trying to work with them. You have police, but you have also the intelligence services, and the communication between all those services was not always at the best. And I think that's where the problem was shown.
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee a change in the way Belgium treats the whole issue of Islamic terrorism?
But we already see a change now because the day after it was shown that the people who made the attacks in Paris were in Brussels a few weeks ago, the authorities directly decided to take their responsibilities, and they really wanted to take measures to and repression also against those little groups. But now we see that 2 years ago, maybe it would have been better to have a list, a dynamic list of people who are a danger to our society. Now the services decided to put that list, to set that list in January 2016, just next year, in January, this list will be set up, and a list with a very detailed list with people who are in Syria now, people who want to go to Syria, people who came back from Syria, and for each people there would be a level of threat that would be established between every person.
I thank you very much.
Thank you.
And this has been our special edition of The World This Week. We'll see you here next Sunday. Have a good weekend.